You scroll past a Gen X meme about hating everything and don't quite relate. You scroll past a Millennial meme about therapy speak and don't quite relate either. Friends born 5 years before you and 5 years after you both feel like they're from slightly different countries. You remember the exact ringtone your family's first cordless phone made. You also remember setting up your first email account at 14. And nobody, in any of the conversations about generational identity that have dominated the internet for 15 years, has ever quite been talking about you. If you were born somewhere between 1977 and 1985, give or take a year, you belong to a microgeneration researchers have only recently started naming. They call you Xennials, the analog to digital bridge cohort, the people who came of age in the exact decade the world rewired itself. And the reason you've spent your whole life feeling slightly out of step with the cultural conversation is not that you don't fit in anywhere, it's that you fit in everywhere, which is a much harder thing to notice from the inside. Here's the thing nobody talks about. Generation labels are useful precisely because they describe a shared formative experience. Boomers had the post-war boom. Gen X had latchkey childhoods and MTV. Millennials had the recession and the rise of social media. Each cohort shares enough common context that the label actually means something, but the Xennials were born in a 5 to 8 year window where the formative experience kept changing under their feet. You were old enough to remember a childhood without the internet. You were also young enough to be in the first wave of teenagers who got online before adulthood. You watched the world go from analog to digital in real time, not as observers, but as active users. Your formative years didn't have a single stable cultural baseline. They had two. By the time you hit your 20s, you were fluent in both, and somehow belonging to neither. The term Xennials was coined in 2014 by sociologist Dan Woodman of the University of Melbourne, who argued that the people born between 1977 and 1985 had a meaningfully distinct generational profile from both Gen X and Millennials. Woodman's research identified a key marker. The Xennials had analog childhoods and digital adulthoods, with the transition happening during the late adolescent window when identity is still being formed. That timing matters. Research on the adolescent brain has shown that experiences during this window get integrated more deeply than experiences before or after. In other words, your nervous system encoded both worlds as native, not one as the original and the other as the upgrade. Both, equally, as the version of reality you grew up in. Older people experience the digital shift as something that happened to them. Younger people experience the analog world as something that happened before them. You experienced both as yours. Picture this. You're 16 years old, the year is 1999, and you're using a landline phone to call your friend to ask for the number of the boy you like. You write it on a piece of paper, you hang up the landline, you walk to the family computer, you wait 3 minutes for it to start up. You log on to AOL Instant Messenger using the screen name you've had since you were 13. You type the boy's screen name hoping he's online. He is. You spend the next 2 hours typing carefully constructed sentences to him, then waiting to see the little ellipses that meant he was typing back. That single afternoon contains both halves of your formative life. The landline, the paper, the screen name. The ellipses, most people you know either remember only one half of that scene or remember the whole scene as a museum piece they read about. You remember it as Tuesday. But here's where it gets interesting. The Xennial profile isn't actually about being caught between two generations. It's about being the only generation that learned both operating systems at the developmental window when both could become native. You can navigate a conversation with someone who refuses to learn smartphones and a conversation with someone who's never written a check, and you make both people feel understood. You translate without realizing you're translating. That's a piece of cultural infrastructure most workplaces and families quietly rely on, without ever naming. But there's more going on than just translation. Xennials tend to have an unusually grounded relationship to technology. You were old enough to remember when it didn't exist, so you don't experience it as the air you breathe. You're also young enough to use it fluently, so you don't experience it as the threat older generations sometimes do. You can put your phone down for a weekend without anxiety, because the part of you that formed without phones still remembers what that life was like. You can also pick it back up Monday morning and use it as well as anyone 20 years younger. That dual fluency, which felt like nothing when you were forming it, is the rarest cognitive trait your cohort carries. And here's the kicker. Xennials are uniquely positioned for the work the next decade is going to reward. The most valuable people in modern organizations aren't the ones who know the latest tools fastest. They're the ones who can hold steady through technological change, because they've already been through it once at the most formative point in their lives. You know what it feels like to learn a new operating system in your bones. You know what gets lost when the old one disappears and what stays the same underneath. That perspective, which has felt like exhaustion for most of your career, is about to be the thing companies pay for. And this shows up in ways you might not notice. Xennials tend to be the people who hold the social weather of mixed-age groups. You can sit at a Thanksgiving table with your Gen X uncle and your Gen Z cousin and broker, a real conversation between them, because you actually speak both languages. You can write an email that lands for the boomer client and a Slack message that lands for the junior hire, without noticing your code switching. The people on either side of you, 2 and 3 generations away, often think they understand each other better than they do. They don't. They understand each other through you. Now let's be honest, not fitting in anywhere has real costs. You probably don't have the generational identity that gives Gen X and Millennials a built-in community to argue and bond with. You're often the bridge in groups, which is useful but also tiring, because the bridge holds the weight while the road on either end just gets used. If you've spent a lot of your life feeling like everybody else has a team and you're the one explaining the teams to each other, that's real, and it's a fair thing to find lonely. But for the people who learn to recognize what this position actually gives you, here's what you carry. You have a kind of cultural fluency that requires no translation effort on your part, because you were formed in the translation itself. You can hold steady when the next technological wave hits, because you've already lived through one. You can sit in any room with any age group and orient yourself faster than anyone else there. You are not without a generation. You are the connective tissue between the generations on either side of you. That isn't being left out. That's being placed exactly where the bridge is most needed. The work isn't to find a tribe. It's to recognize that you've been quietly serving as the tribe everyone else's tribe relies on, and that this is a kind of belonging the loud generations on either side of you have not figured out how to name yet. There's something quietly remarkable about Xennials. They walk through ordinary days carrying a kind of cultural bilingualism most generations will never develop. They remember rotary phones and they remember installing their first messaging app. They speak fluent boomer at work meetings and fluent Gen Z at the dinner table. They have spent most of their adult lives wondering why nobody's quite describing their experience in the generational conversation, without realizing that the conversation itself was being held together by them. If you've ever felt like you don't fit in anywhere, this might be the moment to consider that the people on either side of you fit in, partly because you're the one making it possible. You're not generational driftwood. You're not stuck between. You're someone whose formative years gave you fluency in 2 worlds most people only ever live in one of, and the not fitting in is the cost of being the only ones who, in any room, actually fit everywhere at once. There are a lot of patterns nobody has named yet about the quietly different ways your mind and your cohort work. If you want to keep finding them, subscribe to Silent Awareness. The channel exists to name the things sitting unnamed in plain sight, and your subscription is what keeps it going.